Romanin. Actually, I represent several different organizations. We started the Renters Lobby in Washington, D.C. It's the only organization that represents residential renters in the United States directly. Number one, because of the crisis post-2008, we started the Housing Crisis Solutions Coalition based on our work in Phoenix, Arizona, and what we call our test bed in the desert, to create operating models that would support very low to moderate income individuals who had no access to housing for a number of reasons. One, supply, which is the supply crisis, and then two, the commercial marketplace has created screening systems that really deny access to housing. So we developed a new operating management system to deal with the individuals who have been denied and don't have access to housing, which today we call the supply crisis gap. Just very quickly, anecdotally, one of the reasons that it occurred to me that direct primary care would become a real possible alternative on-site in our developments and in the affordable housing situation. Our average tenant income in Phoenix, Arizona, of our test bed, is $18,500 a year. Half of those individuals in our housing are single mothers with children, 1 or 2 children. As a result of that, we had to develop systems and keep costs to a minimum. And by the way, one of the things I haven't mentioned is that all of our affordable housing and competing with our product is all privately funded. And just for a little oversight on that, typically in the affordable housing industry, you purchase older facilities, and all this is apartments and multifamily, Class B, C property, refurbish, and then provide that housing facility to the market at the lower rents. We developed a portfolio of over 2,000 units in Phoenix and Tucson, Arizona, following that purchase, acquisition, and repositioning process with our investors. The problem was that we had such enormous demand for our product, we would never be able to meet demand. So we were never able to meet more than 10% of our total qualified applicants in any of our facilities. That's really what we call the problem for access. Our byline with our operating model became we provide openness and access for the convicted, the evicted, and the financially denied. Instead of screening people to come into our properties, we actually opened up and used our operating system to be able to manage their success. So we're going to go through a couple of the fundamentals here on what we're dealing with. The one thing I should mention is that, again, the reason it occurred to me that bringing in DPC, because I was conducting, Pat and I had been talking for a couple of years about this, is that I had several tenants, for example, come in, being aware of the DPC movement and based on Pat's information. I had one tenant come in who was being pursued by the IRS because he couldn't afford the individual mandate penalty. He was distressed, very concerned. At the same time, he had to go through his annual cancer review because he was a survivor of colon cancer and couldn't afford not only the $695 penalty, but also couldn't afford the $700 annual. So it occurred to me that we should try calling one of the DPC groups that I'd been told about in Phoenix. I asked the individual to call that office. It was extraordinary. The gentleman sat at my desk, made the call. Someone answered the phone at the DPC office and spent 15 minutes with Ed Gilbert on the phone and answered all of his questions. Asked him for his email, would be happy to call back. I asked Ed, ask who you're talking to. And in fact, it was Kendrick Johnson, the MD, who had spent that amount of time with that individual. Ed's response was almost like he was cured of everything just by having the opportunity to talk with that doctor in that fashion. So really opened up eyes. The impact on the individual and being able to have access alone is just extraordinary. Okay, let's see. So essentially what we're talking about here is integrating what we call economic rental housing. We're approaching affordable housing strictly from the private sector. We realize, as I mentioned earlier, when you go through the standard process of acquisition, repositioning, and then reintroducing properties, you're usually working with older product. The problem is that there's no supply on that side. We realized at that point that the only way that we could ever meet demand, either in our own circumstance or at a national level, is to seek out other means to accelerate the speed of product to market. The only way that that became feasible is using new building technology. So for the last 2 years, we've been working with the Modular Building Institute and several other organizations in the modular industry to develop a program where we can increase the volume delivery of end product, all privately funded, to compete with HUD construction programs. We'll go into the specifics on that. Any questions thus far? All right. So essentially what we've done is we've come up with new models. We refer to economic rental housing versus affordable housing. And what we are doing is integrating DPC, where we will provide facility at our sites for access by our tenants, as well as surrounding what we call tenant, client, patients. So we're going to define the problem, go into our innovative solution sets. We'll describe some of the new paradigms we're dealing with, not only in terms of the hardware and construction, but also in the management systems. And then we'll discuss the growth and opportunity. So, is there a doctor in the house? That's what we're addressing here. Let's see if we can get to the next slide. Pat, do you have anything you want to add? There we go. Okay, so we're going to define the problem. We're in the healthcare and housing. What we're discovering are a tremendous number of parallels, not only in terms of how we're delivering product, but how we're managing, and the problems with the existing systems. And we'll go into those today. We'll define get a little more clarity on what. Oh, here we go. Okay. What are the parallels, and then we'll discuss some of our solution sets. All right, we're essentially going to try and keep this to 101, but what we're really addressing in our market is very important. One of the things that everyone defaults to when we start talking about affordable housing is that, number one, it's the preserve and the default responsibility of the government to provide affordable housing. So I want to be able to define really who is the customer in the affordable housing space. What we're dealing with here, and one of the things, by the way, that we made projections on early on, post-2008, is that when you look at the variables that are evolving in our population with regard to demographics, we suspect that through 2040 we could see a balance between rentership rates and home ownership rates. And there's a number of reasons, macro and micro, that we could elaborate on that. But the bottom line is that our population is changing, our financial profile is changing, demographics and lifestyle conditions are changing considerably, and so we expect to see higher ownership rates. So, what are we talking about here? For the Housing Coalition, what we've identified is that 60% of all renters in the United States with incomes of $18,000 to $35,000 a year represent about 40% of the labor force. This is the segment of the renter base that we're working with. The 25% of all renters making $37,000 plus represent the general population. They're not a concern. This is the area, the 15% is where we place what we call special needs. That's where homelessness is. We're not delivering product or providing the services that we're talking about today to those who are in the special needs category. We're talking about individuals and families in the 60% that are working, paying their bills, trying to pay their rent, of course, health care hinges on that significantly. When we talk about, you'll hear it a lot, rent burden, the problem we have today is that the average rent in the United States for a one bedroom in the aggregate is $1,500 per bedroom. And of course, there are a number of reasons that's the case, and it really has to do with the fact that industry is building Class A and luxury apartments. Those are all the cranes that you're seeing up in your various cities. They're not building affordable housing. We'll give you the numbers on that. So again, we're going towards a renter nation, demographics, financial, economic, and policy issues. We're preparing papers on that. We're dealing today in what we call fourth generation affordable housing. We're developing fifth generation. These are some of the definitions, but does everyone understand how we're defining affordable housing? The classic is the government builds affordable housing through the Housing and Urban Development Agency. All right, we call that AFH. What we are doing with our new technology, working with the modular building industry, working with the Modular Building Institute, is that Scott described in his presentation the question of risk. In our investments in the commercial real estate industry, we deal with risk and make assessment in terms of property investment. It's really interesting how we can be considered innovators. We're discovering so many avenues of innovation and opportunity. It's almost infinite. But what we also are as innovators, we're disruptors. And that's really what we're introducing here. So we're challenging through new building technology and what we call modern methods of construction. We've developed risk mitigation models in our financial investment to allow us to deliver product that comes in at half the price of what that national aggregate average is today. So we know, and we're building towards what the budget requirement is of those very low to middle income individuals who can pay no more than $650 a month for a one bedroom. So we're coming in at less than half based on our building using new modular technology to deliver a product that that single mother with a child can afford. The existing system is built through what we call P3, or public-private partnerships, based on tax subsidies. HUD spends on project development over $10 billion a year. We think that can be better utilized. We'll discuss that. So I've just discussed special needs housing. We're not involved in special needs housing. That's the 15% of the rentership base that requires special requirements. We're economic housing by design, meaning we are bringing the market to affordable housing using new building technology, efficient means of installing and building product. We bring our costs down significantly. So our coalition programs, which we've spent a lot of time, are really designed to work with political policymakers and work with process to accelerate the delivery of housing structures and housing developments. In Phoenix, we're talking, we're building what we refer to as affordable living communities. And you'll see here later that a significant component of that can be the healthcare service. This was just brought to my attention. I'm sure there's plenty here, and keep in mind, I'm less than a layman when it comes to the medical component and the delivery of services. But this I found very interesting. If you take what we refer to as rent burden, we're saying in round numbers that's $20,000 a year. This recently came out, I think it was the Star Tribune, which I think there's the paper here, I'm not sure, but reported on this Kaiser Family Foundation report. The headline, family health costs with employer plans is $20,000 a year. That roughly equates to what an individual or family has to pay for their rent based on those national averages. That's $40,000 net dollars a year. That absolutely eliminates the ability for people to gain access to housing, and is the definition of crisis for a big component of that 60% of the rentership base that exists in the United States. What's the reason? We refer to captured regulatory market and closed markets. Whether it's perception, misperception, misunderstanding, and mispricing, the construction industry believes and understands that in their minds, the private markets can't build affordable housing. We're saying that simply isn't the case. The reason they believe that is it's based on traditional construction, and we'll show you some of the numbers on that, and we're penetrating that difficulty. This, of course, when you talk about captured regulatory and closed markets, it's really a big reason why we have hyperinflated costs. We'll get into those numbers as well. Any questions on this? Okay.
I think one of the critical things is to see the parallels between this rapid escalating costs of just normal housing, just normal rentals. More people are not, an increasing percentage of people are not being able to afford to buy houses. They're stuck in the rental market. The cost of rent keeps going up faster than wages. The cost of healthcare keeps going up faster than wages. So these two crises now, families are really torn between whether they can pay their rent or obtain healthcare. And this is why we're trying to merge the solution together.
We have some numbers for you a little further down on why we believe it's extremely feasible to integrate the two major concerns. So again, what is affordable housing? It's multifamily. It's not single family housing. And this is something that also is a big issue in terms of how people perceive what is affordable housing. Affordable housing isn't the millennial who can't come up with his down payment. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people having a roof over their heads. And that's that 60% of all renters in the United States with that income stream. So we refer to very low to middle income renters. You'll hear us talk about VLMI. Part of the problem, what we, instead of P3, public-private partnerships, we've reversed that. We talk about 3P, politics, policy, and process. So with our Housing Crisis Solutions Coalition, we're developing programs to address those three key components head on. If you go to any city, including Lancaster, you walk down to City Hall, people are pulling their hair out on how they're going to resolve the housing crisis. I'll let Pat talk about the healthcare crisis.
John, we're going to have to start speeding up these slides here so we can get.
All right, so very quickly, on the political side, there's a lot of resistance. I mentioned earlier, when you're an innovator, and we are saying that we're being distortive in what we're presenting, you're also very disruptive. So, but we're coming in with solid solutions. Here's the big issue here is what the cost is. And of course, what is really a big concern today is the fact that these costs are impacting business and our economy. This is a busy chart, but the two things that I want to bring up is that under HUD programs, and there are public-private partnerships, particularly under what we call the low-income housing tax credit, they're building at about $600 per square foot. Those are hard costs. With modular, our aspirational effort is to get down to $92 a square foot, which we know we can do. Here's one of the big reasons. It takes 3 to 5 years to build affordable housing under current programs. We can, aspirationally, but we also know technically we can do that in a tenth of time based on how we're designing and managing our systems. This is the crisis. We need 8 to 10 million units over the next decade product. That's the supply deficit. Last year, under the current programs, HUD, in partnership, delivered 25,600 units throughout the United States. That's it. It's a paucity of the need. And it's getting worse. The problem today is that, again, based on the perceptions we mentioned earlier, everyone believes that the government has to be the vehicle of delivering affordable housing. Not the case. This is the deficit on a national basis. It's interesting how we see it on the two ends of the continent. Okay, so underproduction is causing the crisis. We have a solution to that. We can build. Long-term tenancy management is the most important component for those who come into our projects. After construction is done, which is where the industry is, the most important aspect of success in the affordable housing space is what we refer to as tenant-centric management systems, where we've done a simple pivot from property management focused on real property versus real people. So we've developed very nice qualitative behavioral-based management systems to direct the success of the tenant.
So the parallel here is sort of transforming property management into services for people who are renting as a way of improving the product. Sounds a lot like the patient-centered medical home, except for this one actually is a home.
All right, so we've done a really very simple aggregate accumulation of data that we're taking from HUD budgets and then taking what amounts to what we call pro forma. I mentioned earlier that when we're building, whether you're building 1,000 units or 1,000,000 units, you go through that financial pro forma process. Because of the traditional way of going about building, the focus is on risk mitigation and risk, but it's also based on achieving a certain price level. What's the maximum amount of rent that I can charge to get the biggest profit? And so we call that price-led pro forma. So we had to redesign all of that. And what we do is we build what we call PERC analytics or PERC pro forma, which is based on financial projections that are cost-led pricing. We know we need to and we want to deliver $650 a unit with new construction. So we built our financial pro forma and our investment performance targets based on that 650, 857. Real quickly, the bottom line here, and what's really, really important, is for rent alone using HUD subsidies, they're charging $979. We're saying that we can deliver with our product, DPC, catastrophic coverage, we can remove that and just leave it to DPC. We can deliver it, the healthcare and the housing for less than the subsidized unit coming out of HUD. This is our economic rental housing of affordable living in Phoenix, South Phoenix. This is a modular tenancy support center. This is where we'll be housing the direct primary care facility with our family. Okay. Any other parallels?
So there'll be time during the break to talk to John about some of the specifics. The big overview is by challenging the status quo, by looking at things from a new way, innovative way, be able to produce new housing that is affordable, that has access to advanced, integrative, high-value primary care as part of the rent structure. And one of the big things that I didn't realize is this, by keeping people healthy, just like it improves productivity on the job for employers who want to pay the extra DPC membership, landlords actually find it financially worthwhile to pay for access to health care because it keeps their tenants healthier and keeps them able to continue to pay their rent. It's very expensive to evict people, it's very expensive to find new tenants. So by keeping good tenants healthy and able to pay their rent, it's a win-win situation for the landlord, the physicians, and for the tenants themselves.
Yeah.
Quickly, I also understood that you, as part of that tenant support services, you have financial management skills training.
Yeah, what just on what the current systems, the federal government, 3P, economic development agencies, et cetera, down to the local level, we've developed systems, all private bases, what we call tenant-centric management systems. We're using apps and DIY where we put all of the information to build for example, the skills to self-manage and finance, build credit. We're also developing, even going so far as to develop an integrated HSA savings account using an Acorn-like savings program. That is absolutely part of the rental fee. Here's the bottom line. We know that in the affordable housing space, they are the most stable tenants in the industry. Whether you're on Park Avenue or you're in Peoria, Arizona, once these individuals finally get access to safe, stable housing, they're there for life, more or less. And so the management, helping them manage their success is what's key to our management systems and the tenant-centric model. And so we're incorporating the DPC into that management system.
So once again, it's enabling tenant engagement, just like patient engagement, is key to success in both housing and in healthcare. So thank you all for your patience.
Thank you.